all, welcome to the Leadership, Innovation, Ventures, and Entrepreneurship podcast, also known as L.I.V.E. I'm your co-host, Etinosa Ogbeveon, a community coordinator with the University Housing and Dining.
And I'm Brandon Jones, and I'm your co-host. I'm the Associate Director for Student Learning and Development. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. We hope you enjoy it. Welcome, everybody, to the Leadership, Innovation, Ventures, and Entrepreneurship podcast, also known as L.I.V.E. And guess what? This is the very first time we're doing it live. So to everybody in the audience and everybody tuning in online, thank you so much. I'm one of your co-hosts, Dr. Brandon Jones. I'm the Associate Director for Student Learning and Development in Housing and Dining. And I'm going to kick it over to my co-host,
Etinosa. Hey, y'all. It's Etinosa here. I'm the co-host of the L.I.V.E. podcast. I'm a community coordinator with the University of Housing and Dining. And we are so excited to be here. It is another Black History Month episode.
Yes, it is. Super excited. This is the second or third one? I guess it's second, really. Yeah. So we're excited because, again, one, we're doing this in person. Shout out to the Liberal Arts Instructional Technology Studio for allowing us the opportunity to use this space. But more importantly, to be before you all on today, we have a very special guest with us who was actually on episode 14 of our audio version of the podcast this time last year, Dr. Adrien Sebro. And so we decided to bring him back because, one, his work is just incredible, and two, lots of things have happened over the past year in the world of Black sitcoms and streaming services and a bunch of different things. And I thought, who better than Dr. Sebro to come and talk to our audience and really help us to just really unpack this really cool conversation. So first off, Dr. Sebro, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here. Come back from episode 14. I always wanted, when can I come back? I didn't want to know if you wanted me back or not, but I'm glad y'all wanted me back.
Oh, listen, there's always a spot on the microphone for you, Dr. Sebro.
Thank you.
Before we dive into all of our questions and everything that we've got to our online audience, if you've got questions or comments or feedback for us on the panel, but specifically Dr. Sebro, please don't hesitate to drop those questions or comments in the chat, and we'll make sure that we take a look at those. And if it's a question, we'll definitely try to get that answered during our time together today. But at this time, what I want is to give Dr. Sebro a chance to just kind of introduce himself and let you all know a little bit about his background, his research, and his areas of interest, and all the things that make this brother a cool brother, to me, that is. So, Dr. Sebro.
So, here's some background. As I said, my name is Adrien Sebro. I'm an assistant professor of media studies at University of Texas at Austin, the Moody School of Radio, Television, and Film department. And I teach a history of Black media in general, so film, television, digital media, everything Black. I teach that, and really it's about where we find ourselves as Black people in the media and visually where we find ourselves. I always try to make my students reflect on that, how we see ourselves, why we see ourselves this way, and how you can work to see yourself in another way. So coming from my background, I went to undergraduate at UCLA and my master's at Columbia in African American Studies, and my PhD back at UCLA in Cinema and Media Studies. And I've always been interested at the intersection of media, gender, race, and class. And really how much media is informed by who's creating it, by the political moment that it's in. We realize that television aligns a lot with what's happening politically at the time. So with those political thoughts, where do we as Black people see ourselves in the media, right? Maybe networks, maybe streaming, all these things change the way in which Blackness is consumed and produced. So I'm always interested in talking about that in any way. And I study all things Black sitcoms and comedy as well, too. And that's kind of what everything I'm working on. And really, the basis of everything I do is kind of tracking the ontological status of Blackness, how it changed over time, why, and who are the major players a part of that.
Fantastic. So before we dive into a lot of those questions, you also you're a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated.
Yes, correct. Yes,
awesome,
I am.
awesome. Yeah. So shout out to all the Black Greek letter organizations out there. Especially got to shout that out during Black History Month for sure. Yeah. But I want to start with you started unpacking a couple of different things there about media and representation, and more importantly, things from the Black experience. I think that the first question I want to start with, I hope it's an easy one for you, is what is Blackness to you, Dr. Sebro?
Wow, that is the question we try to figure out all semester, all the time. So Blackness to me, it's sometimes it's hard to explain because it's a feeling, right? So talk to my students, right? There's cultural theorist Stuart Hall talks about Black popular culture in general, or Black culture, as kind of 3 tenets of Black culture, like the body, music, and language, right? And I see that, and so when we're watching films, watching TV shows, I tell all my students to look at that, like, what is the Black body doing in this particular space? What's the music playing? How are they talking? Because you realize you can kind of place the time period in which the show is, you can place the artistry, like who's in control of their movements, and really you can kind of trace where people are coming from class-wise as well, or like the neighborhoods because of how they talk, right? So, and the body being such an important thing because, at one point our bodies were owned, and like how freedom, when we got freedom, our bodies were the only things that we kind of owned ourselves, right? So the body and the stylization of the Black body, the fetishization of the Black body is such an important thing, and looking at the way we talk about dance histories, the histories of movement. So looking at all these things, when I think of Blackness, I think of, the diaspora movement, how we look here in America, how we look in the Caribbean, how we look in Africa, how we look in Europe, right? Blackness, transcends space and time. And how us as Black people, we are constantly reevaluating what Blackness means. So there's no fixed meaning to it, but particularly it's a matter of, there is some essentialism, and like we feel like, Blackness is a feeling, it's certain phrases and traits that I can say that we all understand and can respond back to, call and response. But largely, it's a cultural connection to the diaspora starting in Africa and through the migrations and us being taken through chattel slavery as well, and how Blackness, it moves everywhere. So as like Blackness moves everywhere, Black people as well are extended across continents, and that's kind of that's as short as I can be on what Blackness means to me.
No, and I appreciate you defining that. And I know that when you appeared last year on episode 14 of the audio version of the show, you had talked about your father immigrating here from Trinidad, correct? And so do you feel like that had anything to do in the shaping of how you're defining Blackness?
Absolutely, because my father in himself, when he came to Trinidad, he was like, I think 14, right? 17. And he actually came to Trinidad, lived in the Bronx, and went to high school in the Bronx. And he was at a point, he was 17, so he was like a senior in Trinidad, but he came to America. They said his education wasn't like, up to par with American education, so they made him start as a freshman in high school. I didn't know this like 2 years ago, actually.
Wow. So
he didn't graduate high school until he's 21 because they felt that his education in Trinidad wasn't up to it. So, and part of his coming into America, what he did, it was kind of why I studied TV so much, what he did was watch a lot of sitcoms to figure out kind of how it is to act or be like Black in America, because that was the only space we could find what Blackness looked like. So sitcoms in general, or television in general, but sitcoms specifically, were always this space of like determining what Black looks like, especially in the early 60s and 70s that I study mostly, and how people are able to understand Blackness, especially in a time where American Blackness, you're not living amongst different communities. Segregation is very much, may not be by law, but it's by rule, right? So how did people understand Black folks that looked at TV or other media? So my father did the same thing, as like, to not be like this kind of a Caribbean outcast. How can I talk, act, and like be American Black, right? So I definitely see Blackness as this idea, this transfer of, although, he's Blackness by his identity, there is specifically an American Black that people kind of are at times forced to be like, right? It could be coming from the Caribbean, could be coming from West Africa or any part of Africa as well too, and other Europe, et cetera, but or Latinx countries as well. But there's this idea of an American Blackness you have to kind of, sometimes through the threat of violence, have to succumb to in order to like survive here safely. So that's largely a part of like how I define Blackness too, is this idea that it changes where you're at, And if I was American going to move somewhere, become an expatriate, I'd have to, blend to what Blackness looks like there as well too.
I really like you talking about Black in America, being a Nigerian immigrant. There's a lot of cultural differences or just nuances, right? And I'm curious to see, like, based off of your research, like the 60s and 70s to now, are there some qualifications or characteristics that are different or that have just stayed the same in how people are identifying in their Blackness?
Yeah. I would say now people are more comfortable to claim other ethnicities on television, right? They, like, if someone is like, Nigerian American or Nigerian, like it's it's like, you know, it's part of their character that's written into the show, right? It's part of the fabric of who they are, which rather than early television, it was like, you know, and I use the term black so much rather than African American because, you know, a lot of folks, I don't know what their nationality or ethnic background is. So black is kind of this universal term that they can like kind of be involved under. But there are many like, you know, Sidney Poitier, Caribbean actor from the Bahamas, you know, and, you know, you think of people like, you know, Harry Belafonte, all these folks who are assumed like this idea of like, and he was held up as that what American blackness looks like, right? But, you know, wasn't raised here, wasn't born here, had an accent, had to fight through that accent so he can get jobs, right? So this idea that you had to be simply kind of fall into like an idea of Americanized black first to be able to be even considered like, you know, something. But now I would say in shows that are doing a lot better of like talking about diaspora in a lot of important ways. And you see like a lot of black British actors using their British accents now well too. Black Nigerian actors, you know, expressing their Nigerianness, right? Like at times, often, as you probably know, it's used as a joke, right? The accent, you know, you have the parents who are from the country, then you're the first generation, so it's like all like this idea of pulling Nigerianness and Americanness. Where are you at? Who are you? Like, you know, so a lot of shows kind of filter around that now, but that's a story largely that couldn't be told earlier on because, you know, if you're anything other than American in your identity, then you're seen as like a threat. And the kind of same thing was actually with whiteness. There was like early shows that had Jewish, Italian, Irish, Norwegian folks, and then until a point that it became dangerous for them, so they had to kind of claim American whiteness, right? Which is why we see kind of a distance from shows like that, like shows in the 50s and 60s that talked about European immigrants through the violence and through realizing that they're treated better if they just say they're American white. They stop kind of claiming and stop having shows that focus largely on these immigrant experiences. Okay? So it became a matter of safety and trying to distance America, distancing itself from Europe and also distancing itself from other countries. If you're in America, this is how you be American.
So I'm wondering, just in terms of how you describe blackness, what would you say is the current conversation around media from the standpoint of blackness?
Yeah, I think it's in a good place. I mean, obviously, you could always be doing better, but it's in a good place that it's fluid now. It's much more fluid than it has been in recent past. Like we see blackness, like it used to be relegated just like sitcoms, right? But we see much more of it. A good amount of it in drama. We see a lot of it in like sci-fi, supernatural things, right? We see a lot of, you know, documentary work in it, like a, you know, non-narrative film as well. So I think media-wise, we're seeing blackness kind of get away from this monolith, and we're seeing it get away from these very fixed categories that it was in. And then we think about, actually I asked a question in class today, we're talking about, you know, black male actors in like the 60s and how like Sidney Poitier was the ideal black man. There was only, you know, one black man at a time.
Yep.
Right? One black show at a time.
Yes.
Right. And so
I'm glad you went there.
Now there's like 6 black men right now. You know, you know, and I think that's better, right? But the fact that someone's like asking for that progress, I said, yeah, it's progress. But the fact that I can name these people, name all 7 or 6, that's still a problem, right? If I was asked about some white actors, we can kind of go on and on and on, right? And I think that, you know, there's a space now that looks at, you know, right now diversity is a big selling point, right? Every school, every business, everything, like DEI is a huge point, and they're trying to make it clear through Hollywood as well. But I think when it comes to streaming services, I think that the rise of streaming has made diversity a more real thing, rather than images seeming kind of just like plastic in the sense that, like, you know, they're just a black person on screen to check a box. Okay, we have diversity, right? What is that black person doing, right? Is their character culturally specific in any way, or is he just simply a character that's there? Right, and I think that a lot of shows are being more intentional now, but you'll see a lot of like these ensemble casts, the big cast shows, where at times it's very tokenized still, or just to have a black person there to count as diversity. But diversity truly means to me a cultural experience that's expressed through the show. What is them being black? Like, how do we know? Like, they are black in image, right? But what are their actions on the show? How are they practicing their blackness? How do they show difference in that way? So I think, yeah, as far as blackness, it is showing that it can be fluid, right? It's showing that it can exist in different genres. But a lot more work to do, but I think we're going on the right path at the moment.
So you mentioned some of the earlier sitcoms. You mentioned a lot of the, and I know a lot of your work focuses on sitcoms early, like especially within the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah.
I was reading something earlier today. It's an older article from about 3 or 4 years ago, and it talked about All in the Family.
Yes.
And it talked about Archie Bunker.
Yes.
And it talked about his character and how despite certain things, there is a redemptive nature to him if you really look at the complexity of who Carol O'Connor played. Do you feel like Archie Bunker or a character like that in 2022, would a show like All in the Family make it? Because nostalgia's ruling the day right now. Would a show like All in the Family make it in 2022?
Absolutely not. Because All in the Family did what it was, it did what it did. And All in the Family, honestly, it changed culture. Like All in the Family, that was the first show to ever have like a viewer discretion advice type of show, type of description before it came on, right? And it's an important show because it started this era. It was called the era of relevance, pretty much television in the 70s that talked about what's really happening in America from a perspective of a working class white man, right? This very waspy white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, like he's supposed to be the image of the conservative white working class male, which is like most of America, right? So that's he's supposed to be that image, right? And he has his younger son-in-law and daughter. Those are like kind of the new liberal class coming in. So it's really looking at what America is looking at this time period of 1971, what America is like right now. So, but from a perspective of bringing those conversations actually to television, right? Television beforehand was ignoring those conversations, right? And as Archie Bunker is this character, extremely prejudiced. What it was a reality, I think Norman Lear, the creator of the show, said that's like my dad and me. Because that's their culture, that's who they are, that's their history. Not saying anything of it's okay, but it's talking about the reality of the fact that majority of America looks like Archie Bunker, but no one wants to actually admit it, right? But with this new guard of young liberals coming into the play, especially during the wartime, student protests, violent uprising, civil rights movement, kind of the post-civil rights movement era. You're seeing, even with the Jefferson family moving next door to them, you're seeing this way in which neighborhoods are changing.
Right.
Black people are getting money now. They're working. They're owning homes. They're coming to these neighborhoods that were always white, right? So what it did was really make clear the reality of what white America looks like and how white America now has to contend with the fact that people of color are here, and you can no longer block their progress. And I think, Carol O'Connor himself, he hated playing the role of Archie Bunker. And you see him later on in shows like In the Heat of the Night, where he's the white chief that accepts the black cop, right? It's crazy seeing these two people act the same actor.
It was very confusing as a kid to see
very different roles, right? But what he did was, in this show, and I think watching it now, especially as a black person, it's like hard to watch that show because he used all types of, Jungle Bunny, all types of, all types of terms. And think about, wow, 70s television really went there. And largely, there were a lot of laws that weren't in place yet because it hasn't happened yet. So those creators, they took advantage of the fact that, nothing's written, nothing says we can't say this yet, so let's say it. So the way in which he talked and kind of ruminated about the good old days wouldn't be accepted now. It wouldn't even really get past the writing desk. But what it did was make clear that television can and needs to be the space to talk about what's happening in America publicly because it's publicly owned. Like the Federal Communications Commission owns television, runs television on the government side because television is, publicly owned. And it's that's why there's like laws. You can't say certain things on network television. You can't say certain things. You can't, be certain like level of prejudice. If you're talking about certain things, you have to kind of bring the story back around of like how's a teaching moment. There's these things in place because network television is protected, right? Versus like streaming platforms or paid for cable television, right? So CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox, those type of shows, and like PBS are, government has to have regulations on them. So with that comes the fact that how is this television show going to serve the public? And I think at that time period, its shock value was why it got so popular. But when folks kind of sit down and sit with the show, you realize it's serving the public because they're having talks that weren't talked about before. And it's so shocking because everyone knows this exists, but like you can't possibly put that on television. No one wants to actually hear this about themselves. And no one wanted to see themselves in that negative light. And I think that's what that show did in a very important way.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Because I know for me that was something I was thinking about. I'm like, to see Carol O'Connor as Archie Bunker, and then go stay at my grandma's house. And when you on the sick day back in the day, laying on grandma's couch and in the heat of the night.
You getting ready for school
that? Sir. That was that nighttime remedy, right?
And the thing is, without a show like that, we wouldn't have had these important Black shows of the '70s, because that show is shock and awe value, but more so it's grasp over American viewers, because at the end of the day, TV only cares about how much viewers they're going to get,
right?
And how much advertising they can run through these shows. So this show's probably terrible. Like, it's probably saying a lot of bad things, but look, we're the #1 show for 5 years straight. So what they did with that show, they let the creators, Norman Lear and Bud Yorkin, they said, kind of do whatever y'all want to do. They had like this kind of monopoly over television. So they had, at one point of the '70s, 5 of their shows were all top 4 at least in Nielsen ratings, right? So because of the success of that show, they were able to have your Sanford and Son, Good Times, Jeffersons, right? So really, this show kind of was a platform talking about real stuff and how we were able to get more Black actors and writers and producers in the system.
I like that you were talking about how these shows were game changers, right? They had set a precedent, they are changing the narrative. I'd love to bring it to some of the shows that we're watching now, like Blackish, for example. Like, I think that it's ending now, but it was a game changer show, right?
Absolutely.
Like, and what do you think it was about that show specifically that it was on for a decent long time and it was talking about a lot of things that people were shocked that they were talking about?
Yeah. I love Blackish, right? And I think now
show.
it's in its ending season. And I think it's ending on a point that, like, it's time. It's time. Shows reach their time. And I think largely because the creative power, like, the creator, Kenya Barris, not really even there anymore. So, like, it changed the flow of the show and the feel of it. But why it's so important is because, it was that Black sitcom of the time. You know what I mean? Where there are no other Black sitcoms on TV at the moment, but so much is happening in America. Right. And we're seeing the perspective on the news sites, on other sitcoms and television shows, but what about this Black family perspective, right? And a lot of folks, when it first came out, so many folks were like, oh, it's going to be the 21st century Cosby, all that stuff, which I hated that narrative around it.
Same.
Because this is his own thing. And I think that it extends the work because, as important as that show was, that show being Cosby Show, and we're talking about the show, not the person.
The show,
I want to
the
make
person.
that very
Disclaimer.
clear, camera. As important as that show was, and it can't be denied, there were many things that that show did, that show had so much more potential to talk about and address that it didn't, right? But Blackish, really, as an ABC sitcom, national viewership, big network, they really, and I think in an era that Blackish had to be like now, it couldn't have been 20 years ago. It had to be now where more of a kind of a liberal America, more of a liberal space where you have like actual producers and people in the studios that kind of like care more about issues. I would say a little bit more. They're still about the bottom line and the bottom dollar, of course. But we're in a political space that is a calamity, right? And like so much things going on, along with Black Lives Matter movement, along with schools, everything's changing so much. So we needed a way to make it all palatable, right? That's what kind of where comedy comes in the sitcom space. And I think what was able to happen with Blackish, we were able to talk about these very tough issues in a lighthearted way, but real, right? Bringing in folks like, Lawrence Fishburne and Jennifer Lewis. They probably weren't supposed to be long-term characters on the show, but one, they're Black like legends in television, right? Icons. So having them on the show alone was like, all right, that's gonna bring some folks to the show. But really, having this, Black family, successful, to be able to talk about, all the shows things that Cosby didn't talk about, colorism, right? Colorism, difference of opinion as far as like class status of how they grew up. One growing up more, wealthy or more, with a mixed family. One growing up from the hood. Like all these intra-racial discussions that happen. I think that's why it's important because shows talk a lot about there used to be black and white communities, but what about within the Black community, right? You have this very successful, businessman advertising. He comes the head of I think it's like urban development or urban advertising, right? Yeah. Obviously, right? But you think of the comedy and obviously, but how he uses that to all right, if it was a white person in that role, that would be a problem, right? So you think about these things that are real, and it reflects to a lot of folks that are kind of in these positions, and it had now those type of spaces exist in advertising companies, right? So it reflected the way America is now, and brought that full front, and to a point that's there are a lot of naysayers about the show still. A lot of folks still don't like it, white and black. But I think what's important about this show is that they really brought forth a lot of issues that were important to be talked about in a palatable way, but didn't skirt away from the issue, like make it seem like they were kind of like shying away from it. Mm-hmm. The comedy toned it down, which is the point of sitcoms in general, to kind of comedy in general, calm down some of the seriousness, but the show, tackled things that we weren't going to talk about, because the sitcom mode in itself is largely played out. When you think about sitcoms, largely about a family, picket fence, and there's an episode where the kid doesn't know how to dance, he's a school dance coming up, and then, you've seen that time and time again, particularly in white sitcoms.
Saw it in the Brady Bunch.
Exactly, so many times. And I think what's important about these shows, these sitcoms, especially black sitcoms, that you have to, their culture is a huge part of it. So that story comes along with that. And you can't ignore the struggle that comes along with being black, especially with these folks. They're black, middle-class folks living in Los Angeles. I don't care your class status, you're going, as a black person living in a metropolitan city, you're going to face issues. Mm-hmm. It may not be the same as someone living in poverty in those issues, right? But there are going to be issues if not in your neighborhood, at your job, place of business. They're going to be there. So what it does is really tap into also kind of a middle class status of individuals and folks who work at the corporate level, the things that they go through at work. That one white employee that tries to be cool with you or down, right? And all these little things that come about. And I think that it really tapped into a generation of folks who are, a huge buying power in media. But what about their working class lifestyle, or excuse me, their upper class, kind of middle upper class lifestyle at work? It's not simply they at work and everyone's happy-go-lucky, oh, he's the black guy, no. Mm-hmm. There are these small microaggressions that exist kind of in all these spaces, especially the higher up you go, right? And I think that this show made those things clear, and that's why it's so popular and has great moment now. And I think that it was that show that, had the realms to be that one black sitcom show. So that's another thing too. These shows were also important because, or widely watched because there was no other black sitcom at the time. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So that's going to make a lot of people be attracted to this as well, because look, we got to all, especially black folks, hey, we got to watch tonight. We got to get the numbers up. You know? So, so it's very important that a show like this existed how it did. It's ending on a great note, but that goes to a larger problem. There needs to not be just a one show that represents the race, and that show did it for so long. And I think that to a point that it's ending on a great note now, needs to end, but we should never be in that space, especially on network television. Mm-hmm. It's still the most watched form of television. If you think of folks in the rural areas, we think of streaming now as mostly watched, but networks are still the mostly watched because that's what everyone has access to. Right? You don't have to have, because premium cable and streaming company, you have money for that. You have to have. I know I got my cousin account too, but you have to have money for most of this stuff.
Nielsen rating.
Yeah, exactly. The Nielsen rating. You have to have money for these things. So when it comes to networks, those are still the most important. Those are the backbone of what television started as. Mm-hmm. Television is supposed to be kind of this great equalizer. It was called the citizen machine. So television was all about making what an American citizen should hear, should look like, should communicate about. So the networks and what they play, especially about certain communities, that's what everyone can see. Mm-hmm. So if only one show represents that, that's not good. So we need to have multiple shows representing what blackness looks like in many ways.
So do you feel like streaming services are going to help with that? Because you think about, you got Bel Air on Peacock, mm-hmm. You've got Tubi, and then you got, Grownish went out there, and then now you got Abbott Elementary on ABC coming in, Insecure on HBO, which we got to talk about while we got you here. Yeah. You got a bunch of other shows that are happening. Do you feel like streaming services are helping, broaden the number of black television shows that are out there, or because we're so stratified or in so many different places, it's hurting it?
It's helping. It's helping broaden them, but I think it's still an issue, because I think as far as sitcoms on network television, you have Abbott Elementary, which is fantastic. Oh, yeah. And you have Kenan, I believe, Kenan Ivory Wayans, not Kenan Ivory Wayans, excuse me, Kenan Thompson. Yep. Totally different people. Kenan Thompson show, right? Definitely icon in black popular culture and comedy. But that's it, right? Two very different shows. And again, it's always we can always count on our fingers how many there are, but how many white sitcoms are there? How many sitcoms of other races are there, right? But I love that what streaming is doing because, yeah, it is broadening it in an important way. You know, we have what's a Harlem on Amazon Prime.
Yes, love Harlem.
Run the World on Stars, right? Especially seeing black women are really killing it right now.
Yes.
In an amazing way, getting that access to do such, right? And so many other shows and other like premium cable networks, you know, and Atlanta's coming back finally, you know, they all been too damn busy.
Right.
But now they're back, right? So really everything's coming back in full force, and I love that about it. Like, you know, the fact that there is a black show kind of on every streaming service is a beautiful thing, right? I think that it needs to be spread because not everyone has all the services, you know, because now there's a Paramount Plus, there's a Peacock, there's a, and like I'm losing track, and you know my bank account is showing it too.
Okay.
But and I have like that black show, even the dramas. I have my Powers, the whole universe. You know, I'm
Yes.
like, you know, not going off of not just sitcoms, just dramas too. You know, seeing all of it is important, and I think that it needs to be everywhere. So I think it also shows the fluidity of what blackness looks like because all these shows are different. You know, all tackling different types of blackness too. But again. Is harmful to the networks where obviously it is, to have a network show is very difficult. An successful one is very difficult, right? These streaming companies, specifically on like a Netflix or a Prime, Amazon, they have nothing to lose with their streaming because they have such a big, you know, their services is mainly, you know, items that shipped and stuff like, you know, they're shopping through Amazon is what their main service is. They make billions off of that. So if a show fails for them, they don't really lose much.
Because it comes with your subscription.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
It comes with your Prime membership, right?
And you're gonna buy that book on Amazon anyway, right? So, and but you think of Netflix too. They already have your money, right? So they can create a show, and if it fails, it fails, right? But when you think of network television, it's all about the advertisers, right? What shows are the advertisers gonna back, and how can successful would those shows be? So really, when it comes to streaming services, all that is great, but the networks that are still the most watched channels on television, America-wide, what is this saying about what blackness looks like? Yeah. Right? Why is blackness, an array of blackness only accessible to folks who have money? Or, you know, to the access of wealth and class makes a difference to how we see blackness. So I think that there's a detriment in that space where, you know, there needs to be kind of more open forums of how we can experience race in these ways. But largely with streaming services, you know, it comes from a matter of being able to afford them, and that's where we get our array of, you know, I think us at a university, you know, access to certain materials we get is like there's some privilege there, of course, right? But other folks who, you know, may not be here in this space, they don't have access to that. You know, they may not even know what a Harlem is, right? Because that's still very much is a kind of like if you know thing. You know,
it's a great show.
So things like that, exactly, amazing show, but it's still like, you know, if you have Prime and if you have this, you can watch this, and you know, Apple TV Plus comes out with stuff. You know, there's all these things coming out, these different streaming companies, and where it's just like, it's going to come to a point that this kind of array of creativity in streaming might become a deficit because, you know, is there ever a true like freedom of creativity, right? Because there's still a person that controls all this stuff to give all of it to say so. And I think networks are definitely much more rigid because of the the government control around them. But they need to be taken more seriously, and we need to do more work to get things on networks because we need to be able to utilize the public forum to see blackness in a diverse way.
So speaking of the deficit of creativity, we touched on Insecure, Harlem, Girls on the Run. They're all, for me personally, they all have the same basis. They're four black women, best friends. One's uber rich, one might be of a minority, marginalized group, the other one has dating issues. So
the living single girlfriends.
Living single, peace and love, all that stuff. So in my head, I'm like, I'm gonna watch Harlem. Well, I watch Insecure in Harlem because that's what I got.
I got you.
Watch them both.
But I mean, the storyline's the same. Yeah. Is that kind of what you're seeing with the deficit of creativity and that it's placed everywhere? So. Is it going to be new? Like, is a storyline?
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing you mentioned. I think in that aspect, I would say, like, it's funny you said, like, the Insecure, because, like, Insecure, like, is four friends as well, too. I think it goes farther, right? You don't really
I just thought about it. I was like, wait.
It goes further than the other shows, in my opinion, for sure. But you're right. There's this makeup of, and I'm sure there's a production study or audience study like that likes this idea of four. Four is an even good number to work with, right? So you can kind of... You can have that one that, like, you know, you can have the identities. It's like they're doing, it's all about this idea of like a sitcom tradition. So they only do what works. So 4 has worked for them over time because they worked on like Living Single, Girlfriends. This idea that you can kind of spread apart like these different images of what Black women may look like. Right? I think Harlem's doing good, you know, having a Black queer woman there, you know, bringing some more difference. But still, yeah, this idea of 4 women struggling to find love, professionalism. Right, there's always that struggle, right?
Sure.
And I think that, yeah, that goes to a deficit. Well, I think, you know, we look at drama shows, you know, where it's kind of like, you know, I May Destroy You, stuff like that, where it's some difference, but like the sitcom mode tends to be the same. And that's kind of like sitcoms in general, I think now, where they kind of follow a certain formula because sitcoms are still kind of the most, they're like the easiest to be made and the easiest to be canceled as well. Like when it comes to sitcoms, especially ones that are on like a fixed stage, like a 3-camera stage, like that's like cheap for them to make because, you know, you're not moving around the camera, following someone. Not all sitcoms. Some sitcoms are like that now, but sitcoms are kind of cheaper and made. You know, they're quick, especially on the streaming services. You know, we don't have to worry about advertising placements and stuff. Yeah. So they follow a formula that works for them. But I think there needs to be more creativity because we all know the formula already. We still watch it because it's like it's there. You know, and they look like me. You know, so you want to watch people that look like you, right? And you want to hear their stories, but the formula goes over time because it works, but I think other things work as well too. Right. And although these are showing like kind of blackness in different ways for these 4 people, why is there always 4? Why can't it be 2 or 3? Right? And it's this idea that I guess 4 is a good way to spread it evenly, and so we're not too like too leaning into one particular character more than too many others. But there needs to be other forms, I think. And I think, you know, I'm not a sitcom writer, and I know that I definitely would defer to many writers in this case, but there definitely needs to be a way in which we kind of break from these norms and traditions of like certain structures of format. Right. And I think that blackness in and of itself is a thing about, you know, breaking through identity, breaking through formats, breaking through like, you know, preconceived notions. And I think that our identity needs to be expressed like, as far as we need to break through the sitcom narrative because it largely wasn't created by us in general, right? So we got to break through the narrative that's kind of been consistent over time. Yeah. And that first Black show, you know, Living Single, that wasn't until 1995.
That was 92.
92? Yeah, so
92.
With that, it's like, you know, it's 30 years, but it's kind of really not that long ago, right? And you think about it. So even Black women starring in sitcoms is still new. Right, and then you know you have people thinking like Friends is Black living single, right? You know, and people pretend to forget that. You know? So you got to realize these formats and how they're created and they're usurped and given more funding when it comes to casting white individuals, right? So largely we created this form, and which means we can kind of create a new form and break away from that as well.
Yeah.
So do you feel like because you work in the Moody College of Communications and specifically with radio, television, and film.
Yes.
There's several online and some in the room who are potentially your students and some have been your students. What advice do you have for them as they think about their scripts, as they think about their network pitches and the different things that they're ultimately going to go on and do when they graduate? What advice do you have for them for breaking those conventions for the 4 Black women or defining blackness? Like, what advice do you have for them to be able to break into those spaces and shatter those norms or introduce new ones?
Yeah, I like what Moody does, RTS specifically, radio, television, and film does, and a lot of schools don't do this. They make, you know, those who are in production focuses, they make them take, you know, media studies courses, right? Learning media history. That's very important because I think that gets better writers, better people who are better able to like take on this new production industry as it comes, because if you know the history of what's been done before, you know how to make a way forward, and you know how to sometimes even harken back when necessary, right? So if you're making a new show, you know, like kind of a lot of folks get inspiration from these other shows of the past, right? You know how to branch off from them. Like, you know, you made a show from the mid-'70s that you really enjoyed. Like, how can I make that show into like a 21st century version of it? And I think that's very important. So like learning the history is what I always tell my students, which is why I have these courses that track history over time, because it's like, why does blackness look one way in the 60s and a different way in the 80s, right? Think about what's happening politically, right? Civil rights movement versus like Reagan and Reaganomics, right? You have a very conservative 80s. Blackness is kind of like this, fixed looking like, happy-go-lucky family that happens to be black.
Sure.
Right? In the 60s, you have shows like, Mod Squad, I Spy, et cetera, where they're trying to place black people into lead roles to calm down civil rights issues, right? So you think of everything going on in American history has to do with how we see TV in that particular moment. So knowing that history, I think it helps inform new shows that they can create, helps inform what didn't work and why,
sure.
right? And also how they can use their spaces in production to make way for what's new. And I think that what the largest issue is, a lot of folks in production, like they have the power. TV is a producer's medium, largely, meaning the executive producer, the producer has the power. The writers have some power if you get on a staff writing position, but the director in TV is on like a contractual basis, like 1 episode, 2 episodes, and that's it. The director largely doesn't really have control when it comes to TV. It's the executive producer that's there every day. The showrunner is what they call it now, right? That's the power. So to understand how history of executive producers started, kind of mainly in the 70s moment with Norman Lear, Bud Yorkin, Mary Tyler Moore, even Lucille Ball, right? People who kind of pretty much ran the scripts, created the show, did everything on set. That power, and you think of now like a Shonda Rhimes, Ava DuVernay, all these folks who are showrunners, they have kind of that complete control over set. Like it's not really the writers. The writers have a certain say, but like how can you weave through writing and production culture, but also you have to know about the history of that culture, how it started. And that's how you're able to kind of use your power more effectively in that system.
I'm gonna let you take the last question, and then we're gonna take questions from our audience.
Gosh.
Well, no, we're not out of time. It's just we want to give our audience a chance to ask questions as well as our viewers online. We got a couple that are viewing online as well as here in the room, so I want to give folks a check. Now again, if they don't have any, we'll talk. Clearly, we're podcasting too.
I'm curious. So you're in the classroom, you're teaching with a lot of students.
Yeah.
We talked about, identifying with your blackness. How do you feel like, what does the conversation sound like and look like currently in your classes, how students are defining their blackness?
I start the classes always with like kind of what are you watching now, right? Because I like to reflect on, obviously you gotta meet the students where they're at. And also I talk about like my black film course I'm doing right now, what black filmmakers do you know, right? Because I will always try to make sure I teach about ones that no one knows about, right? Ones that are very pivotal, that just like, because this idea of having television and film, this idea of a canon, right? The canon largely is created by, there's canons in every field, education, English, history. This canon of writers who kind of determine what this field is. And majority, more often than not, 98% of the time, those are white individuals, white men specifically, right? Heterosexual men. And I make sure that to ask them where they're at and who they're watching, what's important to them, because I want to determine my class around what's going to serve them best, right? And also, I want them to leave with something. Like, if you have 14 weeks of stuff you already know about, but that 1 week you found someone new, I think that's a success for me, because I think that there's so many artists over time that don't get canonized or don't get put in, these studies of American history because simply they didn't have the support or the funding, or their films didn't reach a certain reach while they were alive, but they had a cult status once they passed away, things like that. I want to bring them back to the forefront and like live through them, because the films are living objects, TV shows are living objects, right? We're commenting now on shows in my classes that happened in the 50s, who I'm sure they probably didn't know the impact of what their show would be then, right? So as far as them defining their blackness now, I kind of take them where they're at as far as like do they even see themselves within this spectrum of blackness, too? Because I think I never assume one's identity and never assume kind of how they see themselves, but I want to also, open them up to like, this is how I define blackness, or this is how, blackness has been defined academically. And I want to always kind of push away from just the academic talk and jargon, because in academia, we find ourselves having a lot of jargon, a lot of ways in which we kind of code our language so people outside of the schools don't understand it. And I always hated that, like ivory tower rhetoric. But it still happens everywhere. And I'd always disliked that. So in my writing, in my teaching, in my lectures, I always make sure to speak to people, as if like it's the first time you're ever hearing about this stuff, right? Because you have to meet them where they're at, and I think also folks tend to kind of act like or feel like they should know these things, so they never talk about not knowing them, right? So I met the other day at class, I showed Boys in the Hood, was like this kind of, if you assume if you're black, you've seen Boys in the Hood. I've had I had about at least 6 or 7 black students who hadn't seen the movie before. And actually, I love that because y'all are gonna remember me in the film now. And they're telling me they cried, all this stuff. I'm like, yeah, you know, when the Ricky tears were flowing, you know, all of these things are, you know, important. Kind of, we feel like staples in black community, right? Of black culture. And just because it was said for us, like, and I think oftentimes folks like, oh, you haven't seen that? Oh, testing, kind of take their black card, testing their blackness, right? And that's one thing I never try to do. Like, I always ask them, like, you know, why you take this class? You know, I think that's one way I barometer, like, you know, how they feel about blackness. And because if they're black and they feel like they don't prescribe blackness, that's fine too, you know. But this class is about black film. We're talking about black film culture, history, people, community, creators, and that's the perspective of all these films. You know, there are other films that talk about black community, but I'm talking about films that are about black people and from black creators. So that's where we are in this class. That's what we're going to talk about. But if you feel like, you know, just taking the class for credit, which is fine too, know that you're interested in the class. We're talking about blackness and how it changed over time, particularly how it's casted over time and who has like the space to talk about blackness. So meeting them where they're at, not judging where they're at based off kind of what they watch and stuff. Because a lot of folks too, just like their upbringings, you know, they may have been barred from watching TV and film, which a lot of folks are. They did, a lot of them, you know, socioeconomically couldn't afford cable, you know. A lot of them didn't have access to movies and other canonical things. A lot of them are immigrants who didn't know about a lot of these shows and stuff too. So I love meeting people where they're at, and I love introducing people to new, especially black people, to new black shows that they never knew about because they see themselves. I did a talk about, you know, A Different World the other day, and like the larger crowd of all black students, mainly they hadn't seen it before. And now they want to watch it because it's all on HBO Max, you know. They all want to watch it now because they're like, wow, I still see, this is like 1988, 87, 88 when it started, and they see themselves in it. Especially the struggles of, you know, being a black student at a predominantly white institution, right? Seeing these black students at an all-black school, how they're able to network, find community. So how can they make kind of their own little community here at UT? So like finding ways to meet them where they're at and stuff that they haven't watched before. All right, let's watch it and talk about it. How do you feel about this? So I asked every student, like, you know, after a screening, what do I think about this? How you feel about it? Did you hate it? Did you like it? You know, and not judging them based off of their, where they're at. Just like talking to them now, like, all right, seeing this film from '85, does it reflect to you now in any ways?
Do you make them skip season 1?
So I show.
I'm intentionally asking that question.
I show episode
folks.
1 so I can show the rest of it. So
okay, just making sure. I'm like, forget episode 1. I'm talking skip all of season 1.
But also
pre-Debbie Allen.
And a huge portion of that, you know, we talk about content creators is why, you know, people when talk about histories of A Different World, we're not talking about any episodes in season 1. We're talking about season 2 onward.
Thank you.
Right? And everything changes. But that is a complete history and lesson, a 2-week-long lesson about what changes when you have black creators talking about black issues on television. And I think that's an important thing, like black content being from a black perspective and what changes in the show because of that.
I know I said Etinosa got that last question, so my apologies for bowling that in there. It's just, when we talk A Different World, it's like I cringe watch season 1 just to be like, let's just get this over with. Let's get this over with, and then boom, immediately we change the theme song. Debbie Allen fires everybody, and it's like, oh, this school went from a PWI to an HBCU like it was supposed to be.
Almost overnight, honestly, and in a great way. And I think that it's important to watch to understand TV history and understand power structures.
Yes,
and understand like kind of this like TV, like all kind of. You know, like you think nepotism in business. TV has nepotism. Like they go to who they know can write television, right? But writing television, like, you know, it's not easy, of course. But writing television is like, you know, a skill, of course. But when it comes to, you know, white studio execs and EPs, they go to who they know.
Right.
And simply a white person who did not go to HBCU or understand the college black culture experience cannot run a show about black college culture. And I think that they rely on this person who is a great, you know, is Ann Beats. Great writer, where Saturday Night Live, great comedian, but you were kind of out of your depth in this case when we talked about specific black culture, and that's not, you know, a discredit to you, but you just can't align with it, right? And I think that that was a huge lesson in the importance of black cultural creators in these spaces talking about black popular culture. But yeah, getting to your question, is meeting students where they're at in their blackness or journey to such, right? I've talked to some folks who like they felt like they told me kind of it was cool. They thought they felt more black after my class. I was like, that's cool with me. I like that. But also too, like once people feel like some students say like they're kind of like not mad but upset with their parents didn't show them these films and shows too, right? And I think that's the important thing is just like these shows track different times in black popular culture and blackness, what blackness looks like in the 90s or 2000s and earlier than that. So meeting them where they're at and showing these films now at a kind of more adult age and like talking through the film rather than just watching the film passing by. It's about literacy, media literacy. Like, what are you learning from this film? Yeah, we just saw a scene of someone doing a drug deal, but let's talk about the character. Is the character poor? Why is he poor? Why does he sell drugs? Do you think he's a bad character? No. Why do you think he sells drugs? Because he can't afford anything else. He has no education because his mom made him drop out of school to go to work. So you think about the societal issue. So like it's about reading the film more deeply. He's not simply a drug addict or should be a drug dealer. Think about why he had to succumb to that. Think about socioeconomic background. Think deeper into film and media, and that's how you kind of get the most out of it, I think.
Excellent, excellent. So what we're going to do now is for our audience that's here in person and all those who are viewing online, going to give you a chance to put your questions in the chat. For those of you who are in the room, feel free to ask your questions out loud. The microphone will pick you up. But don't worry, you won't be on screen. So if you're worried, like, I don't want to be seen, that's okay. You don't have to worry about that. But what questions do y'all have for Dr. Sebro?
I have a question. You kind of answered it, and I'm glad you did. But I was wondering, how do you see the future of like the African diaspora supporting or like crowdfunding platforms like BET to support narratives around the world to like break those misconceptions that have already been made?
Yeah. So, great question. Thank you. There was this like very ambitious thing. I think it's about 2014, I believe. I may be wrong with the year, but it was called Afrostream. It was this proposed platform out of this black Frenchman, proposed platform that was about really the entire African diaspora. So the whole streaming service was about the African diaspora. Every show on there was about, Black Americans, Black Europeans, Black Latinx folks, Africans, et cetera. So the whole platform was about pushing forward media for the diaspora. Right, did a lot of crowdfunding. Went to Silicon Valley to get money, a lot of donations and stuff, and it had, it's kind of it lingered for a little bit. Didn't reach a certain popularity, but it kind of ended up kind of failing because lack of funding. Folks, because it started competing with like at first it was based in Africa, and Nollywood or Nigerian films. That's like the biggest market of film, like pretty much straight to video market that they have there. The biggest market of like selling and creating media. Well, they say second biggest compared to like Bollywood, but really I think it's the biggest. They just have they don't have the metrics to measure how fast that stuff moves in Nigeria and Nollywood, right? But so Afrostream had a kind of control over casting larger West African film because no one was controlling it. And then the very next year, Netflix started casting African film, and that's the person you don't want to be in competition with, right? So Netflix kind of, usurped whatever plans that Afrostream was having to be that only place that you can receive certain African cinema or television shows. So it was very ambitious, but it was kind of like Netflix now is this media giant or streaming giant. Obviously, it was very hard for them to compete with them, so that made it difficult. I think Afrostream still exists, but it's like a kind of more of a if you know, you know. There are great things you can watch there, but I think streaming services have that potential. Netflix has done some a lot of African series now. Speaking on diaspora, they do some work there. I've enjoyed some of their African produced shows, like Queen Sonozo was a really good show.
Love Queen Sonozo.
Love that show. I think it was the first show, Netflix show in Africa, in South Africa specifically.
It was an action genre too.
Yeah, loved it. African woman starring in it, and a lot of other shows. Kings of Joburg, one really good one as well. So the potential is there and the ability is there, but it's mostly a matter of the care. So it goes into a matter of us as audiences and viewers, pressing them for this more. I think we're in a position now, especially with everything going wrong along the lines of DEI, diversity and inclusion. We have the ability now to pressure them more for these things because everyone is trying to. You have the strong black lead. That's their kind of their social media thing. They have it for every underrepresented minority now. They have a kind of a version of strong black lead, right? We're in a space now where we can push for that, and I think that the way African countries now are kind of definitely having more technologies and broadband access, we're seeing more productions come out of there now. So I want to say it'll be for the better, but as of now, it's kind of only Netflix has that power. So it's still centralized, and I think any media that's centralized in one service is not good, because that's how you get a monopoly over it. And that's why, like, the FCC exists to, like, prevent monopolies. No one should be in control of too much media, because that's a huge political power. So it's kind of scary when you think about how much control Netflix has as a streaming power, but they have the ability to. I think it's up to us to kind of continue to further push the diaspora. Like, I myself, I'm working on a class right now about Caribbean film, television, and cinema, because we don't talk about that in diasporas, mainly in courses like that on the East Coast where most Caribbean immigrants are and stuff. But me, as this kind of child of a Caribbean immigrant, and wanting to learn more about the culture of the Caribbean, the movement through, like, Indian folks in the Caribbean, or Southeast Asian folks in the Caribbean, African folks in the Caribbean, these whole different cultures mixing together. I love that aspect of the history aligning with the media. So in order to do that, we have to do a lot of research and kind of bring forth those stories as important to understand the diaspora as a whole. And I think that they need to do more to do that. And it comes from, like, those folks who are kind of going to make that media and present it to them. Yeah.
Other questions from our online group and from our in-person audience.
So there's a conversation that's been going on for, like, the past couple of years now that is basically surrounding Black trauma in media. And it seems like, we'll get a lot of television shows and films that kind of center around, like, the more negative aspects of our history and our culture instead of the more positive, lighthearted stuff that you would get in something like Different Worlds and Family Matters and all this other stuff. So what is kind of your take on, Black trauma in our media, and if it's, staying, if it's going, and just kind of how you view the whole situation?
Well, I'm gonna throw a question back at you. How would you define, like, a negative image?
I guess it would, so let's say you get a show that is based on slavery. I think it was like The Underground, or I think it was called. And so I haven't seen the whole thing, so I can't speak on it.
Yeah.
But just something that would focus on, like, something like slavery instead of, a more modern and, something that isn't so traumatic or triggering to think about.
Okay, yeah, I get that. So I'm glad I asked that question because, I think a lot of folks, when they say positive portrayal, negative portrayal, I try not to say those terms because what can be positive to me may be negative to someone else, right? And I think it's also, it's sometimes subjective, especially, like, I'll try not to use the word stereotype as much because I realize, especially in academia, they use the word so much where it kind of like, what does that even mean, right? And we think of stereotypes, right? Like, and I think we may see certain stereotypes, even contemporary Black stereotypes, where we're like, well, actually, I do know someone that is like that. You know what I mean? Like, where it's like not necessarily like fake or made up. So stereotype, it has a negative connotation though. So I think that I always push folks to always push past those words because think of deeper in them, like, why is it negative to you? Why do you think that's negative? Let's think deeper about this idea of a stereotype. But when you talk about trauma, I think being Black in America, specifically from, or like, you are American, it's hard to imagine, a traumaless, depiction of what our life looks like, even if it is a matter of, a contemporary look and story. Like, it's about, there are times of trauma, even in the best of times. When you talk about, like, In a Different World or other shows like that, there are episodes that are traumatic because they're about the Black experience, like an episode, I think, where, one of the characters is, like, kind of called like an Aunt Jemima figure or like a mammy figure, right? I think the episode's called something about the mammy, right? And being American Black person or becoming Black in America, or, you can be an immigrant and, you may not, you may be like, from a different country, African country, et cetera, but largely you're gonna be seen as Black, right? So being Black in America particularly often aligns one with, issues because you think about how America was built and what it was built on. A lot of it was built on this trauma. But films and shows like, like the TV show Them, right, for instance, right? And that is one where I think this idea of like a trauma porn that folks are kind of into now. And I also largely don't think that's for us, Black people, really. I think it's for other folks largely. I think we watched it because we always want to see ourselves on TV, so we're going to watch it. But I think the trauma is to kind of inform other folks, I mean, like kind of like white liberal folks or other conservative folks, like kind of our traumatic past that they may not believe as true. And so like, let's see this trauma and like hopefully that can kind of get them ideas of like things we live through every day. So I necessarily don't see those things for us. I think I see those for like the greater mass of folks who don't know our stories. Like we know this stuff. We don't need to know that or see it again, right? And I think when it comes to films and shows about slavery, kind of same thing, you know, it was that kind of point of realizing that we built this country. We were part of the building blocks, and this is how we live in America today. You think of like Roots, that kind of, you know, sparked this idea, 1977, sparked this idea of, you know, what blackness is in America now by Alex Haley's, like, you know, genealogy of his, you know, past ancestors in slavery and how and where he is now. That was kind of America's first real look at how slavery built America, right? And it's supposed to be an 8-week show. ABC was so afraid that it wouldn't be watched, they squeezed it into 8 days, right, straight, rather than 8 weeks because they were afraid. They had a show called like the Holocaust miniseries that lasted the entire, it was like when Meryl Streep started, that lasted the entire, you know, season. But they said Roots were worried, so it was, have this over 8 days. I think Roots was nominated for like 30 plus Emmys that year because how good it was. Because it was the first time America had to reflect on its past, right? So we know the past already. But I think in moments like these, where we think about, you know, Black Lives Matter movement, you know, we think about police brutality, it goes a lot to like continuously reminding folks of Black Americans' past and what they had to go through. That really isn't for us, you know, it's for other folks to remind them, this is a traumatic past we had to go through and live through every day. So unfortunately, I don't see the Black trauma stopping, but I see that I see an important balance that's coming, right? Especially in the fields of like Afrofuturism, you know, think of like, you know, worlds beyond like what blackness can be, what blackness can look like, or thinking of alternative histories of blackness. We're seeing a lot of that as well too, in the supernatural as well, which I love to see because it's about reimagining your own blackness, what blackness looks like to you through a supernatural or through like if this didn't happen, what blackness would be. Like we think of like this idea of Wakanda, right? This like kind of, if we had a nation that was never, you know, quote unquote colonized, right? What possibility can we be? Like what heights can we be? So things like that are important moving forward, you know, and you know, shows that are often canceled, right? Like Lovecraft Country, for instance, right? Beautiful show, so much potential. This kind of Black, kind of horror, kind of sci-fi thing, like things we don't see ourselves usually in. This kind of escapist narratives that are important to see Blackness in these ways, but still harken back to Black history. They remind you, so you can do both. I think there are some traumatic points of Lovecraft Country for sure that made me tear up and everything. But when you balance it with, you know, Black possibility and Black freedom and feeling like, you know, you're not in a fixed place, I think that's where we see progress coming, right? But when it's strictly trauma being thrown at you and baited, it's not necessarily for us. It's for folks who feel as though, like, you know, who may have forgotten the trauma that we experience. And unfortunately, those are the folks who usually run media. So those are the shows that get greenlit.
I love Lovecraft Country.
Oh, amazing show. And
I cried when they said they weren't renewing.
Absolutely.
Pardon that deep breath, though. Others. Not seeing it. Oh, please, go ahead.
So a lot of the, I would say, actors kind of seem to repeat, like Viola Davis, Zendaya, Denzel, kind of in the same, like, not tropes, like I love to see them in different aspects, but how do you see like the future Hollywood embracing different roles, like younger generation or even different people? Like who's gonna be able to grab the torch from these trailblazers?
Yeah, we were talking about that a little bit earlier. This idea that there's always been like, earlier it always been like one Black person or one Black woman, you know, it was like a Ozzie Davis and Ruby Dee at one point. You know, it's like one Black person, one Black woman, right? And like, it was Sidney Poitier for like 60s and 70s. It was, you know, Mr. Cosby for a minute. It was, you know, Eddie Murphy. It was Denzel. And at that point, Eddie ran the 80s, right? Yeah. Like he was a superstar. He's what, you know, Kevin Hart thinks he is, you know. Kevin Hart obviously made more money and everything, but like as far as like, you know, think of comedy, the rawness that came out of him. And, you know, I love a Black man making money. I love the work they're doing. But when you think about like kind of the essence of kind of where they came from and the roots of their comedy, it's much different, right? So, but there's always kind of that one person that does this stuff right now. And I was actually saying earlier, like, we're looking at specifically black men, right? There's not just one anymore, but there's like 6, right? And like we can name all of them, right? You know, like all 3 bros from like, you know, Brian Tyree Henry, Lakeith Stanfield, Donald Glover, you know, all the bros from Atlanta, which is why we haven't had a season in 2 years, because they all too damn busy, all right? Yahya Abdul-Mateen, you know, rest in peace, Chadwick Boseman. He was one of these up-and-comers, right? He was that person. I was gonna be like that helm for sure. And of course, you know, Michael B. Jordan, you know. So you have these group of folks, right? And you think of like black women, it's different, right? You know, you have Viola Davis playing everybody. She's playing Michelle Obama coming up. That's gonna be dope, you know. And Viola could do no wrong, you know. But you know, there needs to be an array of individuals because there are many folks out there who are doing the work. So we're having a lot of folks come up in the ranks, largely through like streaming shows and stuff too. But when it comes to films, you know, you have like the Tessa Thompsons, other young folks kind of get this realm up. But I think black women are, you know, definitely needs to be a more concerted effort on getting more black women's faces out there as well. But the fact that, you know, if asked on like who a black lead may be, Mahershala Ali, I add him to that list too. But I can name all of them, right? That's the problem. I think in and of itself, it's, there are progress, the fact that it's not just one anymore, but I shouldn't be able to name all of them because if I'm asked about a white actor, I can go on and on and on. It's not a discussion. You kind of don't know who's gonna be next. But for black actors, we know who that vanguard of folks is, who that kind of clique of black actors are. You know, I didn't even mention Daniel Kaluuya, you know, David Ariola, like all these, you know, black British actors as well too. Idris Elba, you know, old boy who plays in Damson Idris, who plays in
Snowfall.
Oh, yeah. Right? Okay. You know, so many black men shows, but again, that makes it also clear to how many, how less of black women-led vehicles are there. You know, there's no more Scandal, there's no more How to Get Away with Murder. We're the black women-led vehicles.
More Insecure.
Right? No, we're Insecure now too. That's still, you know, ending on a great note. Great note. Because, you know, sometimes shows can go on too long, as we all know. But that makes it clear too the lack of black women-led vehicles there are as well. So these companies, especially streaming, they have the ability to make that possible. But I want to see it happen more so in the feature space, right? When we look at, you know, we look at the Academy Awards, we look at big award shows. And mind you, I hate the award rhetoric because so many great stuff doesn't make awards. Right. And we all know it's all political who these awards are. But I would like to see a face of like black female actresses, best actresses. I would like to see 5 out of 6 be black. That would be amazing to see, right? In whatever world that may possibly be. But I think that it's moving in a direction specifically for black men because that's how this, you know, patriarchal system works. You know, black men first, and then black women, and hopefully black queer people. Well, excuse me, black gay men first, then black queer people. And you know, and so this way it moves, this very patriarchal system. It's moving slowly but surely, but I think that it just really makes clear the lack of black women vehicles. We need more because, again, we can name all these folks, and which is beautiful, but I want there to be a time where there's an array of folks. I'm like, damn, who was that? She's dope. You know, I want to see her next, right? So yeah, the potential's there. It's just a matter of, you know, they're probably like, y'all like Viola Davis, so we're going to throw her on the second one, right? Which no one's going to complain about, of course, but we need to make concerted efforts to show, again, the array of what we look like as a people and how we act. And we're not fixed in certain identities, and certain people don't represent all of us. And I think they're sometimes throwing Viola that image, like, look, you the black woman, so be all of us, right? Yeah.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Go for it.
Yeah, so The Wire showed a harsh but real look into the reality of inner city Baltimore.
Yeah.
At the underfunded schools and stories of Michael, Randy, Eamon, and Duke, the North Boys. So what are your thoughts on the portrayal of that very real aspect of Black existence in America, how they're handled, and the need of those stories to be told?
Man, I love that show, and so I'm glad you mentioned, like, that's the shirt I'm wearing. You know, it's
Love The Wire.
Love The Wire. I love the show. This is probably my favorite season. I believe it's season 4, like, because they do, like, you know, police department. They do like the docks, the education system.
We
politics.
didn't like the docks. We didn't like the docks.
I didn't like the docks at all.
Okay,
Season 2
thank
was,
you. Nobody liked the docks.
That's where they got away from us. So 3 brought us back, right? And then season 4 about journalism and media, print media. This season for sure hurts to watch often how it ended.
Oh yeah.
Beautiful, but very real in that aspect, but extremely important, these shows. And I think this show is one important because, again, it's from a white showrunner, David Simon, but his co-writer of the show, David Mills, a black man from Baltimore area. This kind of shows the importance of having a black writer in the room, a black consistent staff writer, because all of the show wasn't particularly from like a black producer's perspective. Having that consistent writer in the room who also worked on like Treme and other shows, David Simon, made it clear the black Baltimore that you're going to get in the show, right? Someone who could reflect on that. And a show like The Wire, I think, in a very important way, really talked about how the city breaks down, looking at a larger city, right, and how it breaks down its politics through, the mayoral office, how that breaks down to education system, to the police, to even the dock worker. Although I hate that season, it is important to see how the money rolls in a city, right? The illegal workings of it, and which is what's cared about. And how police are involved in all these aspects too, especially a port city. Those are the cities where the most corruption happens because that's a huge moneymaker. A show like this and the fate of these individuals is kind of a product of the environment thing that's kind of hurtful to see, but it was so real. So if it ended in a way it was kind of happy-go-lucky, they all go off to college or something, it would, of course, it would be beautiful to see, but the realism would drift off there, right? Talking about the circumstances and how, one ended up, I don't want to spoil it, but it's been a while since The Wire.
It is, I'm about to say.
But to watch it, everybody, I think how one of them, I won't say who, but how one of them, ends up in the system, right? How one of them, ends up from the family that deals with drugs. That's the one that ended up being saved, in a sense, going to the private schools and all that. One ends up on the run, and then one ends up, his only community was with drug addicts, so he becomes a drug addict. And this idea that your community really, where you feel comfortable at, that was the only space for him, right? And it just hurts to see, but it's the fate of so many people in a community like that. Some young black boys, and for this to be the state, it was hurtful to see, as a black man, like myself who went through foster care, who had a parent who dealt with, drug abuse, all these things that, I felt it a lot. And I think that it was important to show these stories because, it showed the real grittiness of what a city can do and how the city's, every working part is a character. Education system is a character in the city. The police, they all make up the experience of this kind of microcosm of what's happening to the kids in that city, right? And they're lacking going to school, how they have to survive. And, you feel bad for them because, they're selling drugs and stuff. You may see them and okay, they're drug dealers. But look at their surroundings. One kid, his dad was one of the kingpins in this large organization, so of course he's going to want to do drug dealer too, right? One kid is he lives in extreme poverty. His mother steals from him when he has money. He has to shower at school, so he's going to be a part of his environment. He's going to latch on to whatever ways he can get money, right? So I think shows like this are important because they really tap into this idea that a lot of shows, a lot of news will say poverty is the fault of that person, Like my homelessness in Austin, you think all this stuff, knowing their stories and knowing what came of these things is what's so important. So I teach my students, and looking at media, let's talk about the backstory. What made this person who they are? We watch Boys in the Hood, talking about Doughboy character who played by Ice Cube. What made him this, tough gangster is because he's always trying to protect his brother and get the approval of his mother the entire film. The whole time. He's not a bad guy whatsoever. He wants to protect his brother but his mom also treats his brother better than him. So he's always trying to always be, in his mother's eyes, is cared about. So he always was seeking love and affection and validation. So these things often, especially for young black men, young black children in general, this need of wanting to feel belonging and feel community, that's largely why they come together. And the fate of them often is dependent on the community and what happens. So these 4 kind of drift off into different spaces of life where the one who was born into the worst, financially the best, but kind of the worst situation, born into a drug family, ends up being the one who's the most well-off in the end. Because he found someone that gave him a break or cared about him. And you realize that that's the fate of a lot of individuals and stories that haven't ever been told before. So that's always what's important, to always cater to the stories that aren't told.
Great question.
Yeah, definitely.
Other questions? Yes.
What are some type of like shows, or I guess we're talking about television? So what are some type of black shows or stories, parts of the culture that you would like to be explored in the future? Because I feel like everybody kind of has their ideal show of like what they would want to see.
Yeah.
So what kind of stuff would you want to see?
Yeah. Someone gonna take my idea and write it and win awards off of it. But no, I always share information. So for me, I've always wanted to, in the style of I got caught into like the Shondaland early stuff, like Grey's. It's like what's season 18 now. Right now, I just want to see how it ends. I'm like, I've spent 18 years watching this show. I need to see how it ends, right? But like, I got into shows like that to talk about, the personal lives of the folks in certain jobs. I think of like a show like Grey's Anatomy. I think a comedy like Scrubs, both about kind of both about surgeons or the life of like living as surgeons, but like comedy versus drama, right? So I've always been interested in shows like that. But then I think of like a show that really came out that kind of was kind of an idea I always had was that show The Chair that came out on Netflix, right? I love Sandra Oh, great actress. But I always wanted to talk about this idea of like how maybe a comedy around kind of like, black faculty at a predominantly white institution, right? A comedy around that, like, you have the black person in the sciences or the black person who like does the romantic languages, but they're like, that's part of their character, right? Them being a romantic languages professor is part of like their smooth character. Like funny things like that. I always think about stuff like that, right? Like, and how, the AFAM person is like he only wears black-owned stuff. Things like that is always funny to me. Like, I always think of like, stories of like folks in these professions that we don't really see the true story of them about. What is it that black professor went through, or what is it that kind of made them go into the field of academia specifically. But really, I just like seeing black art in many different ways. So like, other than that, I love to see things are talking more about black folks in fashion and style, or black designers and stuff too. I love shows like, a lot of the creative shows that talk about kind of the design process. Like, I look at a service like Complex, like, right? That's like sneaker shopping and stuff like that. I love stuff like that because they're talking to people about like, shopping for sneakers and talking about the history and stuff. And then they're all talking about like, this idea of sneakers and like how it was a part of culture for them. And for myself too, when I think of like, when I like wear clothes and I think about who made this, like the fashions and like especially like black culture and how it advising that. I think that's why in my black popular culture class, I do a whole week on like black fashion and like what comes from that, right? What made them design a shirt this way? What are they saying with the clothing? What is largely saying about kind of the history they tapped into? So things like that. I love hearing stories about that. It doesn't need to be a TV show. It could be like a a YouTube series like that. And I love media actually that isn't structured by the constraints of television or film. I love this kind of homegrown media that comes from like a Vimeo or a YouTube series, like where you can kind of not necessarily do what you want, but you kind of is like made for you and by you, that you can kind of like lower budgets, like stuff that really kind of in front of a camera, talking about your livelihood. So I really enjoy like a lot of random YouTube shows about like or channels about like folks experiencing new cities, stuff like that too. Like especially black folks experiencing new cities, like how to be black. I ran a couple on like how to live a black Austin experience, like stuff like that randomly, right? And that's the thing beautiful about media, especially the openness of like a YouTube in general, is because the kind of freedom that opens you to different things, right? And you can kind of make a show out of anything, or what kind of taps into your fancy about style, livelihood, culture, and whatever things that kind of surround those things, I'm always really interested into. But lately it's been a mix of kind of like fashion and hip hop culture have been my interests as of late. Yeah.
All right. We got it. Oh, go ahead, Ken.
And so how would you kind of, inspire like your students or anyone who wants to like have an idea and just like produce it without like worrying about, oh, do I have like enough expertise for this? Is my story like enough? Do I have money for this? Like, how do you kind of support telling your own story?
Yeah, I think the expertise thing, I think first is like, expertise, like you can, research can be done by anyone, you know what I mean? Like find resources, I think. And also when you look at, when you watch, so if you're thinking about creating something, you know, find things that are kind of similar to what you want to create, but obviously you're the difference, right? What about you is different? Why would they come to you? I think that's an important thing, right? Of all the, I just talked about fashion, so I'm gonna bring that up again. Of all like the fashion sites, right? What about your site is different? You know, maybe you focus specifically on, you know, retro Jordans, right? I'm just throwing something randomly out there. But your specificity is gonna be what's most important, right? Why would people come to watch your show, channel, whatever it may be? And as far as like, you know, expertise, it goes to, you know, consuming these things. You know, when I'm a media studies professor, but like I study Black sitcoms specifically, but I have to watch all sitcoms or all television in general because I have to talk about how sitcoms are constructed as a whole and then how we see it as Black sitcoms specifically, right? So it's about being a kind of a master of your craft. You have to really put yourself into there. So really look at things that may not be exactly what you want to do, but are like, you know, tangential to what you want to do, right? They're connected close enough that you can see like, all right, cool, now I need to be more specific to what I want to do. Start with the overarching themes of what you like, what things may touch that, and then from there you can find specifically what's for you. That's how you gain kind of like a visual expertise when watching things. But also, you know, I, being in a visual field, but I'm also on the study side, so I have to write and read. I much rather watch things, but I have to read for my job and for my writing because I have to know what has been written about already because that informs how my work's gonna be different, right? They talk about the show already. Many people talk about the shows that talk about my writing, but how am I talking about the shows differently? What am I taking from these shows differently as well? But also giving respect to those who came before you in that way too, like talking against them, fighting an argument, right? So reading these things is gonna be important too. So reading, watching, and also really people you know are gonna be like your harshest critics. So I think also be open to showing them your things. Like if you're creating a new media, a new channel, a new show, whatever, or writing something, show them, get their perspective on it. And I think the best thing is if what you're doing doesn't make sense to someone who doesn't like do what you do, then it needs to be worked on. So like myself, like if I'm writing about history of like Black TV, right? If I'm talking to a friend of mine who works in the natural sciences, right? If they're reading my work and they don't really understand it, then I need to do better in my writing because I need to make it be able to be clear. It should never be just for folks in my field to understand. And I think that's kind of like one of the things in academia that happens so much time. Like they use words, they use terms that are only people in academia can understand. And I think the best things are what's being able to be received outside of folks who just already understand what you're doing, right? So be sure to always kind of share your work with folks who aren't connected to your interest at all. And I think if they can find use or value in it, I think that's a good step as well. Yeah, no problem.
Awesome. Well, we're gonna go ahead and close our session this evening. We wanna thank everybody in our audience and those of you online who are tuning in. We wanna thank Dr. Sebro for all you're doing. You can give him a round of applause. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for hanging out with us and educating us and entertaining and teaching us on this evening. For those of you who are tuning in online and those of you who are here, please make sure that you check in just so we can track and see who all was with us on today. So you got those QR codes down here at the front and in the back. Hopefully in the chat, you all received the not the QR code, but the Qualtrics link, just so we can know who tuned in with us this evening and so that we can follow up with you, get some feedback and thoughts, because I think we're going to do this again. This is our very first time doing this live and in person. We normally only do the audio version of this podcast, so I think we're going to do it again in person. And Dr. Sebro, really enjoyed talking with you. We definitely got to have you back for another conversation. I promise it won't be another year before we do that again. But we got three really happening in the life of our campus this week for Black History Month. Tomorrow, we have a Black History Month poetry reading and writing workshop that's going to take place from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. over in the Littlefield Patio Cafe. And it's going to feature a local artist. Her name is Kamari Hawkins, and she's going to be giving away some of her poetry books as well as some of her writing journals. And we're going to learn how to write poetry. We're going to learn how to create together. And so that's going to be an exciting time. And then on Wednesday, we're going to do an evening with Dr. Moore, where we're going to have a discussion about his new book, Teaching Black History to White People. We're going to have free food and dinner at that event. And there's dinner tomorrow at tomorrow night's event. And then on Thursday, and the event with Dr. Moore is going to be in the San Jacinto Hall multi-purpose room. So make sure you come to that, 5:00 p.m. on Tuesday. Yeah.
Tuesday. Yeah.
No. Tomorrow's Tuesday is Littlefield Patio. This is why I should wrote it down. Tuesday, Littlefield Patio Cafe for the poetry reading and writing workshop. Wednesday, 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. in the San Jacinto Hall multi-purpose room. That's the evening with Dr. Moore. And then on Thursday at our Jester J2 dining location and in Kinsolving, we're doing the diaspora dinners. And so I'm not going to give away the menu, but I'm telling you, if you have not eaten in the dining halls all year, Thursday would be the day I would go, because I've seen the menu. And let's just say, think about all your favorite Southern dishes and all of your international Mediterranean, goodness gracious. Think of the diaspora and think of the food associated with it. Africa, Louisiana, North Carolina, Texas, all of that. Y'all, it's going to be incredible. So come eat, come hang out with us. And, come find me. I'll make sure, if you don't have a meal plan, come find me. We'll figure it out. We'll get you in there. But I know our dining team would definitely appreciate seeing you all and getting your feedback on Thursday's dinner meal. That's from 5 to 7, or 5 to closing, actually, as well in Kinsolving and J2. So I want to thank you all for coming out. Thank you to the Liberal Arts Instructional Technology Studio for hosting us and having us in here as always. We want to thank our media and marketing team from Housing and Dining, and every one of you who came to hang out with us on today. And my co-host, as always, wonderful. Make sure you get the camera shot. Don't close without showing Etinosa, all right? I'll hear about it afterwards. But do you want to give them the final words?
No, thanks for coming. We're so excited for our next episode. We'll talk to you soon. Make sure you get connected with Dr. Sebro. Check out his class and course list for next semester if you're interested in that and having these conversations. So check you guys next episode.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To catch the next installment, be sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Stitcher.
This podcast was recorded and edited in collaboration with the LAITS Development Studios Audio Department. More information can be found at liberalarts.utexas.edu/LAITS. The intro song was composed by Ian Herrera, and you can find his work at ianherrera.com. The outro song was composed by Noah Keller, and you can find more of his work at noahdkeller.com.
We'll see you next time. Texas Podcast Network is brought to you by the University of Texas at Austin. Podcasts are produced by faculty members and staffers at UT Austin who work with University Communications to craft content that adheres to journalistic best practices. The University of Texas at Austin offers these podcasts at no charge. Podcasts appearing on the network and this webpage represent the views of the hosts, not of the University of Texas at Austin.